My twin sister Kate Lowe and I finished medical school together, carrying the same invisible weight of debt and exhaustion and hope, even though our lives never felt equal for even one day, and on the night that was supposed to celebrate both of us, it became clear just how differently our parents had always seen us, because the dinner was held in an expensive Buckhead restaurant, where the tables gleamed and the air smelled like money and perfume and quiet judgment. And I sat there in my simple dress, feeling my chest tighten, while Kate Lowe glowed across from me like this moment belonged only to her. And maybe it always had, because when my father James stood and tapped his glass, everyone leaned in ready to listen the way they always did when he spoke, and he smiled with pride and announced that this night was about family legacy and success, and how proud he was of his daughter Dr. Kate Lowe Price, a future plastic surgeon, and my mother Michelle beamed at her as if the world had finally aligned correctly, and then my mother slid a cream envelope across the table to Kate Lowe and called it a small graduation gift, and Kate Lowe opened it and gasped dramatically and asked if it was really what she thought it was, and my father said loudly that it was a check for $300,000 and that they were paying off her entire student loan debt so she could begin her married life without burden, and the restaurant filled with polite applause and admiration, and Trevor, her wealthy fiancé, leaned in and kissed her while praising my parents, and my mother basked in his approval, as if that alone justified everything, and I sat frozen, realizing my own debt, sat quietly at $32,000 waiting for me at home, and I cleared my throat and asked what about me, and the table went silent, and my father looked irritated and warned me not to ruin my sister's night, and when I asked how our situations were different, my mother leaned forward and explained calmly that Kate Lowe was marrying into a prestigious family, and that appearances mattered, and that her specialty brought status and income, while I had chosen community pediatrics and low-income clinics, and she told me to be realistic and apply for forgiveness programs, because this was Kate Lowe's moment, and in that moment I understood this was not a gift but a transaction, a dowry wrapped in a check meant to impress rich in-laws, and I was not an investment worth making, and the realization hollowed me out as I drove home past the dark clinic where I worked, remembering all the small moments where I had been quietly dismissed, like when I got into a private university and was told to settle for less, or when Kate Lowe was handed money for failed fashion business that was still praised as ambition, and when my mother called my work social work and said nobody respected a poor doctor, and when I arrived home that night and saw the loan notice waiting for me, it all finally collapsed, and I slid to the floor and cried until there was nothing left, and when I called my mother hoping for understanding, she told me coldly that Kate Lowe deserved it more because she chose correctly and married well, and that I was a burden. And when the line went dead, something inside me hardened, and instead of breaking, I stood up and opened my laptop and logged into the Florence Preston Trust that my grandmother had left me after insisting I finish my education, and there it was, millions waiting, quietly released the day I graduated, and when I saw the number I finally understood that the people who taught me realism had no idea what my reality truly was, and that this story was only beginning, not ending. After logging into the trust fund that bore my grandmother's name and not mine, and seeing the full balance staring back at me, a solid, undeniable reminder that someone in my bloodline actually believed in me without condition or performance, I sat still in the glow of my screen, remembering her voice, and how she warned me years ago that one day I would need armor, and that the people closest to me would be the ones who tried to wound me, and I had thought she was being dramatic or bitter or simply too cautious. But now her words wrapped around me like a prophecy fulfilled, and while the rest of world slept, I planned my next move, not with rage, not with tears, but with cold, clear certainty, because this was not about vengeance or jealousy anymore. This was about reclaiming the truth about what it meant to be valuable, and who got to decide that. And as I stared at the glowing digits on screen, over $4 million now fully under my control, I smiled for the first time that night, because I had met her conditions. I had graduated with honors, completed my degree, and now the trust was legally mine. And while my parents toasted my sister for her beauty and connections, and while they patted themselves on the back for securing a future son-in-law from a rich white family with political ties, I was sitting on a silent fortune. they did not even know existed, and I remembered the way my mother looked at me across the table with a kind of distant tolerance reserved for distant relatives, and how she practically dismissed my field as charity work, and said it with a smirk as if my years of studying and training were some kind of hobby. And I remembered the smirk behind Khlo's champagne glass, the one that told me she knew this was coming, and enjoyed watching it unfold. And I thought about how every investment they ever made had her name on it, not mine, like when they funded her failed fashion startup in our teenage years with $50,000 and called it vision and entrepreneurship, and when I earned a scholarship and begged for the remaining tuition, they told me to be realistic and just settle. And that same night I saw them announce Khlo's gift check to the entire extended family with champagne and applause. And not once did they worry about wasting money on her dreams, because they never considered her a risk in me. I was always a gamble, a charity case, someone they loved in theory but never supported in action. And now it was all unfolding in front of me like a map my grandmother had quietly drawn with her trust fund as the compass. And then, just as I was about to shut the laptop, a notification popped up on the screen, an email from Khlo with subject line reading "You're invited," and it was an invitation to her debt-free celebration scheduled at the elite Buckhead Golf Club, a place that practically dripped wealth and white privilege. And I clicked it open, and there it was in all its shimmering arrogance, digital gold leaf text and curated photos of Khlo and Trevor smiling in coordinated outfits, announcing the party of the year and inviting 100 of their closest friends to toast to her new debt-free life. And I stared at it for a long moment, feeling the weight of the irony, because the very people who had humiliated me with that check at dinner were now flaunting it on a public stage. And something inside me settled. I clicked RSVP and selected yes, I will attend, and then I picked up my phone and dialed a number I knew by heart, and the voice that answered was calm, professional, and instantly familiar. Henderson Law, this is David speaking. And I said, this is Dr. Ammani Price, or rather Dr. Ammani Preston. And there was a pause, followed by a warmth in his voice that nearly made me cry. Your grandmother would be proud. He said. I trust the transfer was smooth, and I told him yes, but I'm calling about the other matter, Florence Preston Community Fund, and he answered immediately with understanding that the separate $5 million donation earmarked for a pediatric charity. And I told him I found the perfect time and place to honor her wishes, and that I wanted him there at the golf club this Saturday, and he chuckled softly, saying your grandmother would appreciate the theater of that, and promised to prepare the ceremonial check and make the announcement himself. And I thanked him, then hung up and walked to my small closet. It filled with scrubs and neutral sweaters and the same black dress I wore to graduation, and I knew it would not do, because I wasn't just attending a party, I was staging an ambush. I needed to look like $4 million. I needed to remind every person in that room that the girl they had dismissed had been holding the dagger the whole time. And as I stood there planning my attire, my phone rang again, and it was Henderson, apologizing for the late call, but saying there was one more matter, a sensitive one. And I asked what, and he began describing how my father had once taken a $10 million high-risk commercial loan to cover a failed project, and how he had used my grandmother's real estate holdings as collateral without her consent, and how she only discovered it years later during a routine estate review, and realized he had forged her signature, and instead of destroying him, she had quietly bought the loan from the bank and transferred it into my trust. Now that I had graduated, I was his legal creditor, and I could call in the debt at any time, and that Price Properties would collapse within 24 hours. And I sat down on the edge of my bed, the weight of that power hitting me not like a crown, but like a blade, and I realized that I didn't just have financial independence, I had legal control over the family legacy, and the very name they used to humiliate me now depended on my mercy. And as I held the phone to my ear and stared at the same invitation that had mocked me just hours ago, I smiled again and said, thank you, Mr. Henderson. I will see you Saturday. And when the call ended, I knew this was no longer about me or even about my grandmother. It was about legacy. It was about rewriting the narrative they tried to bury me, and it was about showing them that the girl who served the poor, the girl they dismissed as a burden, the girl they never invested in was the only one who could save them or end them, and I intended to make them feel every bit of that truth in the most spectacular way possible. The Buckhead Golf Club shimmered beneath the late afternoon sun like something from a movie set with uniformed valets standing beside polished luxury cars opening doors for Atlanta's most elite, and as I stepped out of my quiet Uber alone in my floor-length emerald green silk gown, I knew without a shadow of doubt that every single eye would find me because I was no longer the invisible daughter, no longer the one sitting in the corner of their lives. I was Florence Preston's heir, the executor of her wishes, and the keeper of a truth they had never dared to imagine. And as I walked up those marble steps, the weight of that truth settled into my spine like armor, every movement, deliberate, every breath composed, because I had arrived not to attend a celebration, but to reclaim the dignity that had been stripped from me one champagne toast at a time. And just as I reached the grand entrance, they appeared, my mother, Michelle, her face stretched in a polite panic, her hands clutching my arm, as if her social standing depended on it, and maybe it did, and behind her, my father, James, eyes narrowed, jaw clenched like a man watching a fire grow behind a locked door, and my mother hissed through her teeth, "Ammani, I cannot believe you showed up," and I turned to her with a calm smile, and said you invited me, I RSVP'd, and she whispered that it was a formality, that I would behave myself, that I would not mention my loans or my anger, and that this night was not about me, and I nodded slowly, letting her believe she still had authority over something, anything, and I said, I understand, I'm just here to congratulate my sister, and I left them standing stunned in the marble foyer, watching me glide into the ballroom, as if I owned it, because in many ways I did. The chandeliers sparkled above a sea of white roses and perfectly dressed guests, and I made my way to the bar, ordering sparkling water, keeping my mind sharp, my hand steady, and then I saw her, Lo, my sister, in a custom-fitted white dress, the fabric catching the light like snow on glass, her fingers adorned with diamonds, her smile sharp enough to draw blood, and she walked toward me with the kind of grace that had always won over rooms, and said with mock surprise, "Ammani, I truly didn't expect you to show up. I thought you'd be working a double shift at the clinic, or drowning in your poor doctor feelings, and I said you look radiant, Happiness suits you," and she laughed, that high artificial laugh that always came right before something cruel, and she said, "Oh, happiness and money go so well together, don't they, and isn't this place divine? Daddy really spared no expense, and Trevor and I are flying to Monaco for 3 weeks, private jet of course, but I guess you wouldn't know much about that," and she took a sip of champagne, and said, "By the way, Mom told me about your little phone call about your begging. She told me they just couldn't swing it, not after paying for my future," and she patted my arm and said, "It's sad, really, some of us are just better investments," and she turned with a smirk, leaving me by the bar like a stage extra, and I watched her walk away, knowing she had no idea that the girl she thought she had humiliated was the only reason any of this glitter existed, because I could end it all with a phone call. I could shatter the entire Price legacy with one decision, and I turned away from her smile and saw my mother again dragging me toward Trevor's parents, Eleanor and Charles Van Pelt, who stood like statues of old wealth, adorned in real diamonds and practiced grace, and Eleanor looked at me and said, "Oh, you're..." The other one, and my mother jumped in quickly, saying, "Yes, this is Ammani. She's doing community work, really social medicine, so noble." And I said, "I'm a doctor of pediatric medicine," and Eleanor smiled in a way that made it clear I would never be anything but an afterthought, and then Khlo reappeared, basking in their praise, and they told her how proud they were of her, and how generous her family was for donating $50,000 to the hospital, where she would soon be working, and I stood silent, doing the math, 300,000 for her debt, 50,000 for a hospital wing, all impress the Van Pelts, while I had been told to fill out government forms and apply for forgiveness, and as the lights dimmed and the ballroom quieted, a spotlight landed on the small stage, and my father stepped forward, microphone in hand, smiling like a man with a brand new yacht, and he spoke about legacy and investments, and how proud he was of Khlo, and how their gift of $300,000 had cleared her loans, and how their $50,000 donation would help establish the new Van Pelt wing of the Emory Cosmetic Surgery Center, and the applause was deafening, and I stared at the table in front of me, counting every dollar they had handed to her future. And then, just as he prepared to leave the stage, another figure walked up from the side, David Henderson in his dark tailored suit, holding a leather folder, and the room fell silent, unsure of who this man was or why he had interrupted, and my father whispered in panic to my mother, "David Henderson, what is he doing here?" And my mother's face turned pale as snow, and Henderson adjusted the microphone and introduced himself, and the room froze as he mentioned the Florence Preston Community Fund and the wishes of a woman valued service over status, and he announced a donation on behalf of the fund to be given at the time and place of the administrator's choosing. And then he turned and pointed to me seated alone in the back, glowing in green silk, and said the donation was made in honor of Dr. Ammani Preston, the sole beneficiary of Florence Preston's trust. And the spotlight followed me as I stood and walked toward the stage, past Eleanor's confusion, past Trevor's shock, past K.H. Lowe's open fury, past my parents' disbelief, and I stepped beside Henderson, and he held up the ceremonial check, $5 million to Atlanta Community Children's Hospital, and the room exploded in a way no one had expected. Phones raised, flashes, blinding, applause thunderous, and I stood there not as the forgotten daughter, but as the woman who had just outgifted the entire Price family by 100-fold. And I looked at my parents, whose faces had turned to ash, and I knew I had only just begun. When the applause finally softened enough for the room to breathe again, Mr. Henderson handed me the microphone, and in that moment the weight of every year I had swallowed, my voice pressed against my chest. But I did not hesitate, because this was not about courage anymore, it was about truth. And I looked out over the sea of stunned faces, the Van Pelts frozen mid-celebration, the guests whispering, phones still raised, my parents standing rigid, as if gravity had doubled, and I began to speak calmly, clearly, without anger, because anger would have cheapened what came next. And I said good evening, and acknowledged the confusion in the room, and explained that my grandmother, Florence Preston, had very clear instructions for her estate, and that she tied those instructions directly to my graduation. And then I turned my eyes slowly to my parents and thanked them for teaching me an important lesson about investment and prestige, and how clearly they explained that some choices and some children were more valuable than others. And a low, uneasy murmur rolled through the crowd as my mother stiffened, and my father clenched his jaw, and I continued, saying that my grandmother also believed in investment, but hers was different. She invested in character and service, and the quiet work that never made it into speeches or parties. And then I looked directly at my sister, K.H. Lowe, whose smile had vanished, and I said that Florence believed a doctor's worth was not measured by the wealth of their spouse or the exclusivity of their practice, but by the lives they touched when no one was watching. And I said she believed helping a child breathe in a low-income clinic mattered more than perfecting a nose in Buckhead. And I felt the air shift sharply at the Van Pelt's table, but I did not stop, because the truth does not pause for comfort. And I said the $5 million donation was her legacy, her statement about what real prestige looked like, and that she chose the Atlanta Community Children's Hospital because that was the work she valued and the work I dedicated my life to. And then I looked at my mother and said, "You called me a burden for choosing this path. You said I was not a worthy investment." And my grandmother disagreed, and she left me this money not as a gift, but as armor, so I would never have to beg anyone again. And the room was silent in a way that felt almost holy. And then I lifted my glass of water and said that in addition to the hospital donation, my student loans had already been paid in full by the trust the moment my degree was conferred, and that this was truly a debt-free celebration for both sisters. And I congratulated K.H. Lowe, calmly watching her champagne flute slip from her fingers and shatter on the floor. And when I stepped down from the stage, the silence followed me, heavy and absolute, until Eleanor Van Pelt rushed toward me with admiration dripping from every word, praising my grandmother and my vision. And suddenly Trevor stood before me, eyes sharp, calculating, reassessing me like a ledger entry, and I realized with a sick clarity that he had already abandoned my sister in his mind, because the numbers had changed. And K.H. Lowe stormed toward us, accusing me of planning everything and ruining her night, and I told her I had only accepted a gift, and spoken my truth, and if that ruined anything, then perhaps it was never solid to begin with. And then my parents appeared desperate and shaken, my mother demanding to know why I kept the trust a secret, and I asked her why I would tell the same people who dismissed me, and she had no answer. And then my father grabbed my arm, pulling me aside, whispering in terror about endangering the family company, and in that instant I understood that he knew exactly what I knew, and I calmly asked him if he was referring to the $10 million loan he took out using my grandmother's property as collateral without her consent, and his face collapsed, and I explained quietly that she discovered the forgery, bought the debt, and placed it in my trust, and that I was now his creditor, and the power in that moment was absolute, and he begged me not to destroy the family, and I told him I would not, but I would restructure the debt, and my conditions were simple. First, he would write a $300,000 check to the Children's Hospital tonight as an equal investment, and second, he and my mother would host a public dinner and apologize openly for how they treated me, and when my mother screamed that I was blackmailing them, I told her this was accountability, and when she refused, I raised my hand to call Mr. Henderson, and only then did they agree, trembling, humiliated, defeated. And as I walked back into the ballroom, I saw Trevor approaching me again, admiration dripping from his voice, telling me I was powerful, a visionary, that he had made a mistake choosing the wrong sister. And as he spoke, I saw K.H. Lowe watching us shattered, and I let him finish, and then calmly told him that while my sister wanted him, I found him cheap and opportunistic, and that I would never touch a man who traded loyalty for profit, and I walked away without looking back. And moments later, Trevor ended the engagement, publicly humiliating K.H. Lowe, and stormed out, leaving my family in ruins. And as guests whispered and left, I stood with the doctors from the Children's Hospital, who thanked me through tears, explaining how the donation would save lives and fund an entire neonatal unit. And I looked across the emptying ballroom at my family, collapsed in their own consequences, and felt no triumph, only exhaustion and clarity, because I finally understood that winning was never about revenge, it was about freedom, and I had just claimed mine. As the ballroom emptied and the whispering spread like wildfire through the silk-lined corridors, I stood by the marble bar, quietly letting the echoes of my speech settle into the bones of the room, and across the floor Chloe stood alone, a ruined silhouette, wet in white, her makeup smudged, her eyes darting wildly between her parents and the guests, as if trying to find one person who still saw her the way they did just an hour ago. And she marched toward our parents, who were still frozen in the corner, locked in the weight of what they had lost, and her voice cracked as she screamed that they had lied to her, that they had handed her the spotlight while hiding the truth, that I was the real heir, the one with the trust fund, the one with the power. And she slammed her fists against the table, yelling that she had nothing while I had everything. And our mother Michelle tried to soothe her, saying it could all be fixed, that Trevor would understand, but it was too late because Trevor had already stormed out moments ago, his pride shattered, his reputation burning behind him like dry leaves, and my father James sat slumped in his chair, his hands shaking and his eyes glassy, staring at the check he had written for K.H. Lowe's loans, now nothing more than a receipt for his own humiliation, and I turned away from them not out of cruelty, but because there was nothing left to say, and I found myself surrounded by people who had never spoken to me before: doctors, administrators, board members from the Atlanta Community Children's Hospital, and their eyes were wide with gratitude and awe, and one by one they came forward, thanking me not just for the money, but for the voice I gave them the moment I stood on that stage, and said that poor children mattered more than prestige. And Dr. Ellison, the chief of pediatrics, gripped my hand tightly and told me that for 3 years they had been trying to build a new neonatal intensive care unit, and had been denied funding again and again, and that my donation would fund the entire unit for the next 5 years. And a woman in a sharp navy suit said they could now purchase ventilators for babies born at 24 weeks, that they could finally take in emergency transports from underserved counties, and that no more infants would be turned away because of lack of equipment. And as they spoke, I felt something rise in my chest, not pride and not revenge, but purpose, the quiet, steady kind that anchors you to the earth and makes you realize that all the years of struggle, all the nights of studying while being told I was second best, were worth it because I had done something real, something permanent. And while the people who raised me were tearing themselves apart in the corner of a crumbling party. I was being seen by people who mattered for the first time not as the other daughter, but as a force of good, and I let them talk, let them tell me about their vision for the hospital. The children, they would save the parents, they would help communities they would now reach, and I nodded because I was not just the donor, I was part of the work, and I promised to visit the unit once it was built to meet the team to support their programs long after the cameras were gone, and in the corner of my eye, I could still see Kate Lowe standing in her wrecked gown, tears falling down her cheeks as she watched her carefully constructed world implode. And I remembered the way she smiled when she opened that envelope at the celebration dinner. And I remembered how she sipped champagne as I asked about my own loans, and how she never once defended me. And I knew this was not karma, this was simply the truth unfolding. And as I turned to leave, Dr. Ellison said something that stayed with me. He said, "Tonight, you did not just make a donation, you made a declaration about what matters, and you made it with grace and fire, and that no one in this room would forget it." And I thanked him, and stepped away, feeling the eyes of the room follow me as I crossed the floor one last time, and paused near the exit, watching my parents argue quietly, my mother hissing through clenched teeth, my father gripping the edge of the table, and I knew that in the days to come they would try to rewrite this story, try to paint it as a misunderstanding or a misstep. But the truth was too loud now, too public, too real, and I was no longer afraid of their approval. I was done chasing it, done asking for a place at their table when I could build my own. And as I walked through the open doors out into the cool night, ere I took one last look back at the ballroom where it had all come undone. And then I let it go, and I stepped into the darkness, into my own beginning, free, powerful, unburdened, and ready for whatever came next. The next morning arrived not with sunlight or peace, but with a silence so heavy it felt like a warning as I stood in my kitchen, staring out the window at the gray Atlanta sky, holding my mug of coffee like it was the only thing tethering me to the ground, because despite the triumph of the night before, despite the power shift that had shattered the illusion of my family's perfection, I knew the war was not over. It had simply changed shape. The night had ended with whispers and glances, but today would bring calls, meetings, and attempts to spin the story into something safe for them, something they could control. And sure enough, before I finished my coffee, my phone buzzed with a text from my father asking if we could talk, and a minute later another from my mother, this time with a longer message about how she regretted her tone, and that perhaps we had all said things we did not mean, and then a final one from Chloe, no words, just a single broken heart emoji, as if that could reverse what she had done. And I sat at my small kitchen table, surrounded by silence, and thought about all the times I had bitten my tongue, all the years I had been polite and patient, waiting for recognition, even fairness, and I realized with perfect clarity that I owed them no reply, not yet, not until I was ready, and I had more important things to do, because yesterday had not just been about revealing the trust or exposing the truth, it had been about unlocking a door, and now that it was open, I had work to begin. And I powered up my laptop and opened my planner filled with notes I had written late at night between rotations about the clinic. I wanted to open one day a community pediatric center with a mobile unit for underserved neighborhoods and mental health support for families who could not afford therapy. And I read through every word with fresh eyes, because for the first time it was no longer a dream on paper. It was a blueprint waiting to be funded, and I opened the Preston Trust dashboard and reviewed my liquid assets and available distributions, and then opened a second tab, Henderson Law, because there was still one more matter, the $10 million loan my father had forged into existence, and I stared at the digital ledger for a long time, my finger hovering over the button that would initiate the repayment demand, but I did not press it, not because I was uncertain, because I was calculating the cost of mercy, because if I pressed it, the company would collapse within 24 hours, properties would be seized, reputations dismantled, and the price name would become synonymous with fraud. And I wondered whether Florence would have done it, whether she would have pulled the trigger, and I remembered her voice from those late porch talks, how she always said justice without strategy was just noise, and I closed the window because there was another one that required more patience but would leave a deeper mark, and I picked up the phone and called Henderson. And he answered with his usual calm "Good morning, Dr. Preston," and I told him I wanted to proceed with restructuring the loan, and that we would need a formal agreement outlining new terms, including interest payments, a mandatory donation clause, and a personal apology letter to be signed by both James and Michelle Price, and he said of course, and promised to have the documents ready by the end of the day. And then he paused and said gently, "Your grandmother would be proud not just because you honored her wishes, but because you used the power she gave you with wisdom and restraint." And I thanked him and ended the call, then returned to my planner, writing out timelines for the clinic, searching potential properties for lease near the neighborhoods with the highest infant mortality rates. And as I worked, I felt the weight of everything finally shift not off my shoulders, but into my hands where it belonged, and I spent the rest of the day in motion researching calling meeting with a nonprofit consultant and drafting the charter for the Florence Preston Pediatric Foundation, and by dusk I had mapped out a 12-month plan for the clinic and a rollout strategy for the mobile unit, and when I looked up and saw the last light of the day touch the tops of the city, I realized something startling. I had not thought about my sister or her wedding or her debt-free celebration for hours, because my focus had finally turned toward the future, my future not built on their approval or funded by their guilt, but constructed from my own strength and the legacy of a woman who had seen me for who I was long before I saw it myself. And then my phone rang again, this time from a blocked number, and I almost ignored it, but something told me to answer, and when I did it was Trevor, and he started speaking so quickly I could barely catch the first few words about misunderstanding and media coverage, and something about a statement his family wanted to issue, and I cut him off and told him calmly and clearly that whatever narrative they were preparing to spin had nothing to do with me, and I would not participate in any attempt to rewrite the story because the truth had already been spoken, and I hung up before he could respond, and for a moment I stared at my phone, feeling the burn of rage simmering behind his call like smoke, leaking from a fire long buried, and I shook it off because men like him would always circle power trying to clip a piece for themselves, and I was done entertaining their tactics. And as the stars rose over Atlanta and the city began to glitter with artificial light, I stepped out onto my small balcony and stood in the cool air, letting it wash over me, and I whispered, "Thank you, Florence, thank you for trusting me, for believing I was enough." And I promised her and myself that I would not waste this gift, that I would build something she would be proud of, something no one could take away. And I stood there for a long time, watching the night, breathing deeply, knowing that for the first time I was not waiting for anything, I was simply living, and that was more powerful than any check, any name, any toast in a ballroom could ever be. 3 days after the night that rewrote everything, I received an official email from Henderson Law with a subject line that simply read "Finalized documents enclosed," and as I clicked it open, I was met with a wave of quiet satisfaction because attached were 3 files that signified the complete shift in power within our family. The first was the formal restructuring agreement for the $10 million loan my father, James Price, had fraudulently secured using my grandmother's properties as collateral without her knowledge. The agreement had been rewritten under the Florence Preston Trust, with me as the sole creditor, and detailed repayment terms that were no longer friendly or lenient, but clear and enforceable, with deadlines, penalties, and legal teeth. And the second document was a signed pledge of a $300,000 donation from Price Properties to the Atlanta Community Children's Hospital, made in full within 72 hours and designated to fund 2 neonatal transport incubators and several emergency ventilators. And the third document, the one that truly struck a chord in my chest, was a scanned copy of a letter of formal apology from both of my parents, addressed to me and to the hospital board, and while it was typed and notarized and signed with the stiffness of legal obligation, it still carried weight because it acknowledged in clear language that I had been treated unfairly, that my accomplishments had been minimized, that my path had been dismissed, and that their choices were guided by social perception and personal bias rather than equity or support. And as I read the words on that screen, I felt something shift deep in me, not forgiveness and not warmth, but a quiet sense of closure, because they had said the thing they never thought they would have to say, and they had put it in writing not for me, but for the world, and once a truth is written, it can never be unsaid, and I saved the documents into the secure folder in my trust portal, and forwarded the donation pledge to Dr. Ellison at the hospital, who replied within minutes with a string of exclamation points and a promise that the equipment order would be placed immediately, and that I would be invited to cut the ribbon when the new wing opened. And I stared at his email for a long moment, feeling the depth of that invitation, because it meant more than ceremony. It meant I was now part of something lasting, something built from the ashes of disappointment and transformed into hope. And I closed my laptop and sat still for the first time that week, letting the silence settle around me like a familiar coat. And I thought about how fast things had moved since that night at the golf club, how every move had been precise and necessary, but also exhausting, and how for the first time I was no longer reacting to my family, but shaping my own future on my own terms. And then my phone buzzed again, this time with a calendar invite from Henderson, a reminder that in 3 weeks I was scheduled to attend the quarterly Preston Trust advisory meeting as its administrator, and that I would need to prepare a short summary of fund allocations and long-term goals. And I realized that I was no longer just the beneficiary of a trust, I was its steward, and the thought both thrilled and sobered me, because it meant I carried not just my grandmother's legacy, but the responsibility to expand it and protect it. And as I sat there, a knock came at the door, unexpected, sharp, but not aggressive, and I stood cautiously, unsure of who would visit unannounced. And when I opened it, I found Chloe standing there alone, wearing jeans and a pale blue sweater, her hair pulled back, her face bare of makeup. And for a second neither of us spoke, just stared at each other as if waiting for a signal. And then she said quietly, "Can I come in?" And I stepped aside without answering, because whatever this was, it needed to happen. And she walked in slowly, like someone crossing a minefield, and sat on the edge of my couch, hands folded in her lap, eyes fixed on the floor. And I closed the door and leaned against the frame, waiting. And finally she said, "I didn't come to fight." And I nodded and said, "Good." And she looked up, her eyes already glassy, and said, "I don't know where to start." And I replied, "Start wherever you want." And she inhaled like she had to drag the words from somewhere buried. "I didn't know. She left you that money," she said, and I thought she meant a few thousand for books, or maybe some tuition coverage, but I didn't know. She made you the trustee, and I didn't know. She gave you control over everything, and I didn't know. She bought Dad's debt and put it in your name, and I didn't know that you were building a clinic, or that you'd been planning it for years, and I didn't know that you were doing any of it, because no one ever told me, and I didn't ask." And her voice cracked, and she wiped her face. "I thought I was the only one who had pressure," she said. "I thought they loved you more because you were the golden girl in high school, and I was the one always asking for things. And when Mom and Dad started investing in me, I thought I earned it. I thought it was finally my turn, and I didn't question why they didn't offer you the same. And that night when they handed me the check, I was so caught up in it, I didn't even look at you. And when you asked what about me, I felt this flicker of guilt, and then I buried it because I didn't want to ruin the moment. And when you gave that speech," Chloe said, her voice now trembling, "when you said that Grandma called the money armor, I realized I had never needed armor, because I was never under attack, and you were fighting alone." And I looked at her and said, "You saw it, you just didn't want to believe it." And she nodded, tears falling, and said, "I know, and I'm sorry, and I know sorry is not enough. And I don't even know what I'm asking for." And I said, "Then don't ask, just listen." And she nodded again. And I told her I did not share my plans because they were mine and mine alone, and I didn't need validation, and I didn't want interference, and that the money was never about proving anything to her. It was about fulfilling a promise to someone who saw me. And I said, "You had every privilege I didn't, and you still chose to mock me at that dinner, to smirk when I was left behind, to laugh when I was silenced." And I said, "You were not just silent, you were complicit." And Chloe's shoulders shook, and she said, "I know, and I'm so ashamed." And I told her I did not need her shame, I needed her to change. And she asked how, and I said, "Start by acknowledging it, not just me but to yourself and to mom and dad and maybe even to the world, and then get to work, use your privilege to do something that matters, not to erase what you did but to build something better. And she nodded again and asked, do you hate me? And I said, no, I don't hate you, but I don't trust you, not yet. And maybe not for a long time, and trust is earned, not inherited. And as she stood to leave, she looked at me and said, do you think we can ever be sisters again? And I said, I think we never were, not really, but maybe someday, if you mean what you say, and you prove it over time. And she nodded and stepped out into the hallway, and I closed the door behind her, not with anger, not with closure, but with clarity, because some things do not need to be healed right away. Some wounds require air and distance and time. And that day I chose not revenge, not reconciliation, but truth, and the truth was I no longer needed her apology, I needed her change. The weeks that followed Chloe's visit unfolded like a slow unrolling of truths and realizations each day, peeling back another layer of the past that I had either forgotten, ignored, or been too hurt to fully see. And even though her apology had come with tears and trembling shoulders, I treated it like a seed, not a solution, because it needed watering, consistency, effort, not just emotion. And while she returned to her new job at the hospital with all the same privileges intact, I turned inward, focused on laying the foundation of the Florence Preston Pediatric Foundation, which I now referred to simply as the foundation because it no longer felt like a distant dream or a memoriam. It was alive and breathing and waiting for action, and I spent mornings reviewing location reports and demographic studies and afternoons in long calls with architects, financial consultants, and nonprofit lawyers, slowly shaping the structure of a clinic that would be built not on charity, but on service. And I decided that our first site would be in the South Side area, a place with one of the highest child asthma rates in the entire state, and a critical lack of pediatricians, especially those offering care on a sliding scale. And I visited the neighborhood multiple times, walking through streets lined with aging homes, cracked sidewalks, and children riding bikes past boarded-up grocery stores. And I met with local pastors and school nurses, and one retired midwife who told me stories about delivering babies in living rooms because the nearest hospital was more than 20 minutes away. And I wrote everything down, every need, every gap, and every name, and I promised them that when we opened our doors, they would be the first ones we called, because this clinic would not be a gift from above but a collaboration from within. And as I threw myself into this mission, I barely noticed the distance growing between me and my parents, because there was no part of me that missed their silence, their explanations, or their attempts to control my narrative, because they had already shown me what I meant to them, not just in what they said or didn't say, but in what they chose to fund, support, and prioritize. And they had chosen status over sincerity, appearances over balance. And even now, with their signatures on the loan documents and their public apology published in the hospital bulletin, there was no sign they were changing. They were simply retreating, hoping time would soften the wound and that I would come back on my own. But I had nothing to return to, because I had already built something stronger, something real. And then one morning, as I was leaving a site meeting, I received a call from Dr. Ellison, hospital director, who had once hesitated to support my community program proposals. And he sounded different this time, not skeptical but enthusiastic. And he said, I just got off the phone with the board, and we want to offer you a partnership, not just funding but full institutional support for your clinic. And I stopped, walking stunned, as he explained that the board had reviewed my foundation's mission and had agreed unanimously to designate it as a pilot site for a new community health initiative that would integrate hospital training with fieldwork in underserved areas, and that my clinic would receive resident doctors rotating every quarter along with interns and mobile tech units. And he said, your work has already begun to shift the way we think about community care, and we want to be part of it, not behind it. And as I thanked him and ended the call, I stood under the warm Atlanta sun and allowed myself a single tear, not for sadness, but for the release of years of doubt, because every rejection, every dismissal, every cold glance had led me to this moment where my work, not my name, not my last name, but my actual work, was being seen and honored. And I walked the rest of the way back to my car with a strange lightness in my chest, as if my lungs had expanded, and the air was finally enough, and later that night, as I updated the foundation website with the new hospital partnership and posted a soft announcement on social media, I received dozens of messages from old classmates, some of whom I barely remembered, saying how proud they were, how inspired, how surprised not by my success, but by my clarity and strength, and a few even admitted that they had always wondered how I endured the constant comparisons to Chloe, and I realized that people had seen more than I thought. They just never said anything, and as I scrolled through the messages, a notification popped up, a tag from Chloe, who had shared the post with a caption that read, "My sister is doing the work of angels, and I don't deserve her, but I'll never stop trying to," and I stared at the screen for a long moment, my heart caught between cynicism and a strange new softness, because for the first time she wasn't centering herself, she was just watching and honoring, and maybe that was her first real step. And I didn't respond, because some things don't need a reply, they just need time and truth. And as I closed my phone, I thought about Florence again, and how she used to say that legacy wasn't just what you left behind, but what you planted in the hearts of others. And I knew then that her legacy was not just mine to carry, it was a torch meant to light other flames, and in that moment I felt ready to carry it further into the places she never had a chance to go, into lives she never had a chance to touch. And as the city lights blinked on one by one across the skyline, I promised myself that no matter how many headlines came, no matter how many partnerships bloomed, I would never let the clinic become a symbol. I would keep it rooted in the dirt, in the stories, in the needs that first called me to medicine, and I would remember every door that was closed, every check that was withheld, every dinner where I was silenced, not with bitterness, but with precision, because those moments taught me how to build my own table. And now that it was built, it would have room for every child, every mother, every student who had been told they were too much, too loud, too poor, or too different to matter. And I would make sure they knew that they did. And as I sat back in my chair that night, the glow of the laptop still warm on my skin, I felt something settle in my bones, not revenge, not triumph, but arrival, the quiet, solid feeling of being exactly where you are supposed to be, not because someone gave you a seat, but because you built the entire room. The day the first bricks were laid for the clinic was hotter than usual, the kind of Atlanta heat that sticks to your skin and slows down your breath, but to me it felt like a cleansing fire, burning away every trace of hesitation and regret as I stood beneath the shade of a temporary white tent next to city officials and local organizers and watched the excavators move earth. I was not just witnessing construction, I was watching purpose take form, and I remembered how many nights I had spent as a teenager in my bedroom, scribbling ideas on the back of old notebooks, dreaming about a clinic that was not just a sterile hallway with cold chairs, but a place that felt like care itself. And now that dream had a blueprint, a timeline, and a heartbeat. And while the groundbreaking ceremony had been kept small, I still noticed the presence of local reporters and a few alumni from our medical school, and even two of my former professors, who came to shake my hand and say they always knew I would do something different, something real. And behind them, standing quietly near the rear of the crowd, was Chloe, wearing a simple dress and holding a clipboard, and even though she kept her distance, she didn't look away when our eyes met, and I gave her a nod which she returned with a small, tight smile. And I did not invite her to speak, nor did she ask, because some moments are not about repairing relationships, they are about acknowledging reality. And the reality was that this was happening with or without approval, with or without applause. And as the press snapped pictures and the construction team began laying the foundation, I walked the dirt perimeter, slowly imagining every hallway, every exam room, every waiting bench. And I whispered under my breath, "Thank you, Florence, not for the money, not for power, but for believing in me when no one else dared to, and for giving me the tools to make belief real." And after the ceremony, I returned to my apartment and sank into the couch, finally exhaling. And as I did, my phone rang, and I almost ignored it until I saw the caller ID. It was my mother, and for a moment I just stared at the screen, not with anger but with exhaustion, because I had not spoken to her in weeks, and I was not sure what could possibly be said, but something told me to answer, and so I did. And her voice on the other end was quiet, unfamiliar, unsure, and she said, "I saw the article, and I Said which one, and she said the one about your clinic and the hospital partnership and the new funding, and how the city council approved the land grant, and I said yes, it's happening, and she was silent for a moment, then said I did not think it would be this big, and I said that is because you never asked, and she said I know, and I was wrong, and I asked why are you calling, and she said I don't want to fight, and I said then don't, and again she paused and said your father and I were invited to a benefit dinner in 3 weeks, the one the hospital is hosting in honor of community initiatives, and your name is on the program, and I said yes, I will be receiving the Civic Service Award, and she said I know, and then she asked do you want us to come, and I was stunned not by the invitation, but by the question, because never before had they asked if their presence was welcome, and I said I do not know what you expect from me, and she said I don't expect anything, I just thought you should decide, and I said then let me think about it, and she said all right, and ended the call without pressing further, and I sat in silence thinking about how for the first time my mother was not demanding entry into my life, she was requesting it, and that difference mattered. And over the next few days preparations for the gala continued, and the hospital's media team reached out asking for a video montage of my work, a few personal photos, and a short speech to be read during the ceremony, and I gave them everything they needed, including a photo of Florence from 1978 standing outside the community center with a clipboard and a half smile, and I requested that it be the final image shown before the applause, because this was her legacy, not mine, and the night of the event arrived like a scene from another life, with velvet ropes, valet parking, and long tables draped in white linen, and I wore a dark navy gown with simple earrings, and no family crest, no designer badge, just a silver pin with the foundation logo. And when I stepped into the ballroom, I felt the eyes of hundreds on me, but once I did not shrink. I stood tall, smiled, nodded, greeted every hand with confidence and clarity, and I saw Chloe across the room wearing a gown she probably borrowed and chatting with one of the donors. And then I saw them, my parents, standing near the back near the entrance, both in formal black, with her hair perfectly done, him adjusting his cufflinks, and they did not walk toward me, they simply waited, and for the first time in years I felt no urge to chase approval, no urge to decode their expressions. I simply turned away and moved forward, and as the evening progressed speeches were given, toasts were raised, and then finally my name was called, and I stepped onto the stage to a warm applause, and the screen behind me lit up with the images of the clinic blueprints, the construction site, the community events, and finally Florence standing proud in grainy black and white, and I began my speech not with my accomplishments but with my grandmother's name, and I said this is not about being the best or the first, this is about being present, being willing, being there when it matters, and the room fell silent not out of boredom, but because the truth sometimes demands silence, and when I finished and walked off stage the applause was thunderous, and I did not search the crowd for my parents, I did not need to, because this moment was not about being seen, it was about seeing, and I saw clearly for the first time that my worth had never been in their hands. And later that night, after the event, as I waited for my car in the roundabout, Chloe approached slowly and said you were incredible, and I said thank you, and she said I mean it, and I nodded, and then my mother stepped forward and said I wanted to tell you that I was wrong and that I regret how we treated you, and I looked her in eye and said I accept your regret, but I do not owe you reconciliation, and she nodded, her eyes watery, and said I know, and I turned and left without hugging her, without offering comfort, because sometimes the most powerful closure is letting someone feel the full weight of what they lost. And as I rode home in silence, watching the lights blur past the windows, I felt something new rising in me, not revenge, not relief, but freedom, and it tasted like air after rain, clean, sharp, and entirely mine. The months that followed the gala brought with them a rhythm of steady progress and deep reflection, as the clinic continued to rise from foundation to framework, then walls and windows and rooms taking shape one by one, and I made it a point to be there for every phase of construction, because this clinic was not just a project, it was a living promise, a monument to every child who had been turned away from care because their insurance was wrong, or their address was too poor, or their guardian too undocumented. And each time I stepped onto the site, I felt the dust in my lungs, and I welcomed it because it meant the work was real. It meant every insult, every exclusion had brought me here, and in those days I stopped responding to the polite inquiries from my extended family, who now wanted to reconnect, suddenly curious about my progress, suddenly interested in what I had to say. But I saw through it all the social validation, the hunger for proximity to success, and I had no energy to entertain their revisionist affections, because I had patience to prepare for staff to hire and hearts to heal. And in early spring, just as the dogwoods began to bloom, I received confirmation that the clinic would receive its operational license 2 weeks ahead of schedule. And I remember staring at the letter, my hands trembling not from surprise, but from sheer emotional gravity, because this piece of paper, this dry formal document, meant that what I had dreamed since I was 15 was now sanctioned, real, unstoppable. And that same evening I stood alone in the middle of the clinic's largest room, the future main waiting area, where light spilled through the new windows onto the fresh tile, and I closed my eyes and imagined it filled with laughter and footsteps and the quiet hum of hope. And I whispered again, "Thank you, Florence," and I meant it from the deepest part of me. And as the opening date approached, we began finalizing our team, hiring nurses and support staff, community outreach coordinators, and administrative help. And each resume that passed across my desk, I read with the eyes of someone who remembered what it felt like to be underestimated. So I looked not just at degrees, but at determination, not just at schools, but at soul. And when we finally locked in our core team, I felt proud not just of their credentials, but of their stories, their grit, and their eagerness to serve, not for glory, but for good. And in those final weeks leading up to launch, Chloe began stopping by more frequently, sometimes dropping off donation boxes, sometimes helping assemble furniture or organize charts. And though our conversations remained guarded, there was a rhythm beginning to form between us, not of friendship yet, but of recognition, a slow rebuilding of something broken, not with apologies, but with actions. And one day, as we were arranging chairs in the exam room, she paused and said, "You were always the brave one." And I looked at her, not sure how to respond, and she said I was just better at pretending. And for the first time I heard the truth in her voice and not the performance. And I said, "Pretending doesn't build anything." And she said, "I know," and then kept working. And that was all we needed in that moment, no more, no less. And then finally, on a bright Saturday morning in early summer, the clinic opened its doors, and the ribbon-cutting ceremony was modest by choice, not because of lack of support, but because this space was meant for the people, not for press. And as families began arriving with children in tow, some dressed in their Sunday best, others still in pajamas, I stood at the entrance, shaking hands, hugging necks, and directing traffic with a heart so full I thought it might burst. And all around me staff moved with grace and focus, guiding patients, checking vitals, explaining procedures. And there were tears in the eyes of the first mother, who told me she had not seen a doctor in 3 years for her daughter. And there was laughter from a boy who said, "This place smells like cookies, not like a hospital." And I knew then we had done it, we had made something real, something right. And in the middle of the day, as I stepped outside to breathe, I saw Florence's photo tape gently to the front window with a small handwritten note beneath it that read, "We are standing on your shoulders." And I had to turn away so no one would see me cry. And as the day wound down and the last family left and the chairs were stacked and the lights dimmed, I remained sitting in the main room, alone, listening to the silence and letting it wash over me, because this silence was not empty. It was full of every voice, every heart beat, every prayer that had led to this moment. And later that night, Chloe texted me a simple message that read, "You made something they could never take from you." And I stared at that text for a long time, because it was not just a compliment, it was a confession. And I replied, "Thank you," and she responded, "Always." And I felt something ease between us, not erased, not healed, but eased. And in the days that followed, the clinic began its true work. And every morning when I walked through those glass doors and saw children waiting with sleepy eyes and worried mothers holding forms and nervous fathers pretending to be calm, I knew I was home. And when the nurses smiled and the receptionists greeted each patient by name, I felt a pride so deep it felt like standing on sacred ground, and even when things went wrong, when power flickered or supply shipments ran late or charts were misplaced, I never lost that sense of purpose, because this was not about perfection, it was about presence, and we were present fully entirely. And one afternoon, as I was finishing a patient intake, a woman approached me quietly and said, "You don't know me, but I knew your grandmother." And I said, "Really?" And she said, "Yes, she delivered my son in 1984, when the hospital turned me away, and she said you walk like her." And I smiled and said, "I hope I work like her too." And she placed her hand on my shoulder and said she would be proud, and walked away. And I sat down in that empty hallway and wept, not from sadness, but from the full overwhelming truth that legacy is not a word. It is a weight, and I was carrying it, and I was strong enough to carry it. And that night, as I locked the clinic doors and stepped into the quiet street, I felt the air shift slightly, as if the city itself had opened its arms to me and said, "Welcome," and I whispered back, "I am here." By the time the clinic had settled into a steady rhythm, the days began to feel like chapters in a book. I never wanted to stop reading, each one filled with real people, real needs, and real healing. And though the pace was relentless, it gave me something no job ever had before, a sense of deep, unwavering purpose. And each morning I arrived before the staff to unlock the doors and walk the halls alone, letting the silence speak to me before the day's chaos began. And I often stood for a minute in the exam room, where Florence's photo hung framed on the wall near the sink, not just as decoration but as a compass. And I whispered, "Good morning, Florence," before I slipped into my white coat and started another day. And the stories I heard every day from patients were both heartbreaking and hopeful. And one afternoon, a little girl came in with her mother, both of them nervous, the girl clutching a stuffed rabbit with one missing eye. And when I knelt down to greet her, she whispered, "I want to be a doctor too." And I smiled and said, "Then you're already halfway there." And her mother looked like she was going to cry, and told me this was the first time her daughter had been seen by a doctor in 2 years. And I thought back to the nights I spent studying by flashlight when the power had gone out, and how I had promised myself that one day I would make sure no one had to wait 2 years for care just because they were born into the wrong zip code. And that day after clinic closed, I sat on the roof of the building, watching the sun dip behind the skyline, and I thought about how far I had come from the girl who used to sit at family dinners silent, while everyone praised Chloe. And even now, I sometimes replayed those scenes in my head, hearing the way our parents bragged about her awards, about her interviews, and how they had looked right through me like I was part of the wallpaper. And the difference now was that it no longer hurt, it just confirmed what I had always known, that their love had conditions and my worth had never met their criteria. And now I had built something they could not ignore, and even if they never said it, I knew they saw it. And it was in that rooftop silence that I made a decision. I would expand the clinic, not immediately, but strategically. And I began drafting proposals for mobile outreach vans and for mental health support services. And I reached out to Florence's former connections who were now retired and asked them for wisdom, and many of them said yes and sat with me over coffee and offered their time and insight. And one even offered to come in every Thursday to run a free dermatology clinic for teens. And word spread fast, and more donations began arriving, and people I had never met sent emails thanking me for doing the work that hospitals had neglected. And I kept all those messages in a folder titled Proof. And one morning, as I was reviewing the weekend schedule, I received a message from the hospital board requesting that I speak at their annual leadership conference. And I stared at the email for a long time, wondering if it was a mistake. But it wasn't. They had finally acknowledged what I had built, and they wanted to feature it. And I agreed, but I made it clear I would only speak if I could bring staff members to share the stage, because this clinic was not a solo act, it was an orchestra, and I was only one instrument, and they agreed. And so the following month I stood on a stage beneath a crystal chandelier in a room filled with suits and degrees, and explained how healing begins with listening and ends with presence. And when I stepped down, the applause was real, not performative, and I was approached by several board members who asked if I would consider joining future hospital initiatives, and I gave a measured nod, because I had learned that trust is not rebuilt overnight. And later that week I received A hand-delivered letter from my father, and it was short, just a single sheet folded once, and it read I was wrong, and I see that now, and I hope one day you will let us show you, and there was no apology for the loans, for the favoritism, for the erasure, but there was an opening, a window cracked, and I folded the letter and placed it in a drawer, not out of sentiment, but out of principle, because some gestures deserve preservation, not reward. And as summer turned to fall, and the leaves began to paint the sidewalks gold, the clinic held its first community fair, complete with health screening workshops and a small stage for local musicians and food trucks and children laughing and people dancing, and I walked through that crowd, overwhelmed not by the size, but by the joy, and I saw Chloe near the flu shot station, handing out forms and chatting with parents, and when our eyes met, she smiled. Not the brittle forced smile from before, but something warmer, and she walked over and said, "This is amazing," and I said, "Yes, it is," and she said, "I want to be part of this, if you'll have me," and I paused not out of spite, but because the question was honest and rare, and I said, "If you're serious, start next week, bring your resume," and she nodded and said, "I will," and true to her word, she arrived the following Monday early in scrubs and ready to work, and over the next few weeks I watched as she learned the ropes, shadowed our lead nurse, and slowly became part of the rhythm, and while we never discussed the past in detail, there was a new language forming between us, one built on effort and not expectation. And one evening, as we were restocking shelves, she turned to me and said, "I used to think I had everything figured out," and I said, "I used to think I had nothing," and she said, "Maybe now we're both learning." And I said maybe, and for the first time in years I felt something between us that resembled respect, not rivalry, and I realized that while forgiveness was not mandatory, growth was, and we were both growing in our own way and in our own time. The autumn air was turning crisp, and the leaves that lined the streets around the clinic had begun their annual shift into shades of gold and amber and burnt orange, and everything about the season made me feel like I was walking through a new chapter of a book that had finally found its heartbeat. And every morning I stepped through the glass doors of the clinic with a calm sense of power, like this place had become more than just a building, more than just a rebellion. It had grown into a rhythm that pulsed through the community and returned back to me in every grateful smile, every soft thank you, and every small voice saying, "I want to be like you when I grow up." And yet, despite the joy I carried inside me, there were still moments that lingered like shadows in the corners of the rooms, memories of silence at the dinner table, memories of being overlooked, of hearing my parents say, "Chloe is going to change the world," and never once imagining I would too, and those memories were not wounds anymore, but they were reminders, and reminders have a way of whispering to you when things go quiet. But I had made peace with knowing that I had not just built a place of healing for others, I had built a mirror for myself, one where I finally saw my own worth staring back without needing permission or praise. And as the days grew shorter, Chloe had settled into her role with steady grace, becoming a reliable part of the team, not seeking spotlight or credit, but doing the work that mattered. And we rarely discussed the past openly, but the air between us had softened like a rope that had once been pulled tight, now gently unwinding on its own. And one night, after closing, we stayed behind to inventory new supplies, and she handed me a clipboard and said, "I know I don't deserve a clean slate, but I am trying." And I paused and looked at her and said, "You don't need a clean slate, just a true one." And she nodded, and for the first time I believed her, not because her words were perfect, but because they were quiet, and I had learned that truth rarely shouts. And over the following weeks our parent reached out again, small gestures at first, an email about an article I had been featured in, a voicemail from my mother saying she saw a news clip about the clinic and wanted to know if she could visit sometime, and I listened to that message twice, not out of longing, but out of curiosity, trying to hear if there was any real change in her tone, but it sounded the same, like someone who wanted to be included now that the results were visible. And I sat with that discomfort for a long time, because part of me had waited for years to hear them say, "I am proud of you," and part of me no longer needed it. And when I finally responded, I kept my words short. I said the clinic is open to everyone, and I meant it, but I also knew they would feel the distance in that sentence, and maybe that was fair. And as we moved into the holiday season, the staff decorated the lobby with paper snowflakes and string lights, And the waiting area became a place of warmth and music, and I watched families come in with children wearing coats too thin for the cold, and I ordered a shipment of jackets and had our outreach team set up a donation table right by the entrance, and one little boy picked out a red puffer coat and turned to his mother with eyes full of wonder and said, "Now I'm warm," and I bent down beside him and said, "And you're strong," and he smiled like he had been told a secret he had been waiting to hear, and that night I went home and sat in my small apartment surrounded by the quiet hum of the heater, and I felt something settle inside me, something like peace, but shaped more like purpose, and I realized I had finally arrived at the version of myself I had always imagined, not flawless, not unscarred, but whole. And in that stillness I made a decision I would host a year-end event at the clinic, a celebration not just of the work we had done, but of the people who made it possible, the patients, the staff, the volunteers, the neighbors who believed, and the idea came together quickly with music, food stories, and an award to honor someone in the community who had inspired others to rise, and I named it the Florence Light Award. And when I told the staff, they applauded not because they knew her, but because they knew what she meant to me. And that evening when the event finally arrived, the clinic sparkled with life and joy, and music filled the halls, and kids danced, and elders smiled, and people held plates of warm food and sat beside strangers who felt like friends. And when it came time for the award presentation, I stood at the small podium near the reception desk and spoke without a script. I said, "We are here today because someone believed in me before I believed in myself, and I want to honor that belief by passing it forward. And the first Florence Light Award goes to a woman who has reminded me that growth is not linear and healing sometimes starts with a single step." And I called Chloe's name, and she looked stunned, frozen for a second before walking up, and I handed her the small glass plaque, and we stood there, not as rivals, not even as sisters in that moment, but as two women who had learned to start again. And she leaned in and said, "Thank you for this," and I said, "Thank you for trying," and the crowd clapped, and I felt something shift in the room, like generations of tension had loosened their grip. And when the event ended and the last guests had gone home and the staff began to clean up, I stayed behind to gather leftover food and lock up. And as I turned off the lights, my phone buzzed, and I looked down to see a message from my father. It said, "Your mother," and I watched the live stream. "We cried, we were wrong, we are sorry, and if you let us, we want to come see the place you built." And I read it once, twice, then a third time, and for the first time there was no anger in my chest, just a calm clarity. And I wrote back, "The clinic is open Tuesdays through Saturdays, come whenever you are ready." And I hit send and put the phone in my pocket and walked into the cold night air, feeling the sky above me wide and still and waiting. That weekend passed in a quiet rhythm as the weight of that message from our Father still lingered in the air, not heavy, but not weightless either. It felt like a thread that had once frayed and snapped, now carefully being pulled back through the eye of a needle slowly. And I spent the next few days showing up at the clinic as usual, greeting patients, checking in on the nurses, and watching Chloe fall into her role with more confidence than ever. And it amazed me how life had shifted so far from where we had started back when medical school felt like an endless maze, and the only thing certain was that we both had dreams too big for the small understanding our parents offered, and yet here we were building something real from nothing. And the day they finally came through those front doors, it was raining, a slow, steady drizzle that made the glass fog slightly, and when they walked in I was standing at the front desk, and I saw the hesitation in my mother's step, and the way my father looked around like he was still trying to convince himself this place actually existed, and Chloe was beside me. And when she saw them, she nodded quietly and stepped away, giving me space, and my mother approached first, her coat slightly damp, her eyes softer than I remembered, and she said, "This place is beautiful," and I said, "Thank you," and waited, and she looked at me as if searching for something to hold on to, and then she said, "We are sorry for everything," and my father added, "We didn't know how to support you because we didn't know who you really were, and we didn't try to learn." And he said it like someone who had practiced those words, and maybe he had, and I replied, "I am not looking for perfect parents, just honest ones." And my mother touched my hand gently and asked if they could see the rest of the clinic, and I nodded and led them down the halls, introducing them to our team, showing them the recovery rooms, the pediatric wing, the exam area, and the wall of portraits where we hung photos of our first 100 patients who completed full treatment plans. And at the end of the tour, my father stood in front of that wall in silence and then turned to me and said, "We thought you would be fine without us because you always seemed so strong." And I said, "Being strong does not mean not needing support, it means surviving without it." And he nodded like the truth had finally landed, and as they left, he turned back and said, "If you ever want to visit home, the door is open." And I said, "Thank you, but this is home now," and I meant it not out of bitterness but clarity. And over the following weeks they started showing up not just to see me, but to volunteer, helping with meal distribution and organizing supply drives and even small tasks like cleaning chairs in the waiting room. And one afternoon, I caught my mother laughing with a little girl while helping her color in the kids' corner. And the sound was so unfamiliar in this space, it made me pause and realize that maybe they were learning how to show up not just as parents but as people. And around that time I was invited to speak at a medical conference in another state about creating sustainable community care. And the invitation came from someone I had once presented research with in our third year of med school. And she said, "We have watched your work from afar and would love for you to be the keynote speaker." And the idea of standing in front of hundreds of professionals sharing our journey terrified me and thrilled me at the same time, and I accepted and spent nights writing my speech, carefully pulling memories and data and personal truth into one narrative that reflected not just success but struggle. And I flew out 2 days before the event and stood backstage watching the room fill slowly. And when I stepped up to the podium, I took a deep breath and began with a story about a woman who walked into our clinic with a blood pressure so high she could not see straight, and how she left a month later not just with a treatment plan, but with a part-time job at our front desk. And I said, healing is not just about medicine, it is about restoring dignity. And the room listened quietly, then loudly, as the applause swelled. And I saw people wiping tears, and I realized that this was more than validation, this was transformation. And when I returned home, the staff had decorated the clinic entrance with a banner that said, "Welcome back, hero," and I laughed and hugged them, and Chloe gave me a gift, a photo frame with a picture of the two of us in our white coats from graduation day, next to a picture of us now standing side by side in scrubs outside the clinic. And she said, "I thought you should see both versions of us together." And I hugged her tightly and whispered, "Thank you." And as the year began to close, I reflected on how far we had come from that first moment when I opened the envelope with my student loan balance still unpaid, while Chloe smiled at her zero balance, and how now those numbers no longer defined us, because we had built a legacy not in spite of what we lacked, but because of it. And I remembered, girl, I used to be the one who sat on the edge of her bed counting coins to buy books, and wondering if anyone would ever see how much she gave just to stand in the same rooms others were handed keys to. And I wanted to tell her that one day she would not just open doors, but build them and offer them freely to others, and she would be loved not because she begged for it, but because she became the kind of person people believed in. And I knew in my heart that no apology, no check, no gesture could undo the past, but that healing was never about undoing, it was about choosing what to carry forward and what to finally set down. And so I set down the weight of being unseen, and picked up the light of becoming seen, not by others first, but by myself, and that light would guide everything that came next. The new year arrived not with fireworks or celebrations, but with a sense of quiet steadiness that settled over our lives like a calm tide returning after years of crashing waves. And I found myself waking up each morning not with dread or urgency, but with clarity, knowing that each patient I saw, each child I spoke to, each form I filled was part of something greater than my own healing. And Chloe was no longer just my sister, she had become my partner in purpose. And while we had always been bonded by blood, now we were bound by intention, and every day we discovered new layers of ourselves. Within the rhythm of the clinic and outside the walls of our workplace, things had begun to shift too. I had started reconnecting with friends I had lost touch with during the hard years of training and distance, and the fear of being judged for not having it all figured out no longer held me back from inviting people into my story, and I started hosting small dinners in my apartment with mismatched plates and candlelight where laughter filled the room, and for the first time in a long while I felt seen not as the responsible one or the forgotten daughter, but simply as myself. And one night Chloe and I sat on the floor with takeout containers between us reviewing our upcoming expansion plans, and she looked at me with that same glimmer she had the day we first dreamed of the clinic, and said, "Do you ever think we were supposed to lose everything just to find what really matters?" And I nodded, because even though the pain was real, the clarity that came from it was sharper than anything comfort could provide. And one evening I got a call from a former professor who had once told me I would never make it through my third year because I was too emotional, too soft, and too unwilling to play the political game, and he said he had heard about the clinic and wanted to feature our model in a journal. And I said yes, not to prove him wrong, but because I finally understood that my softness was not weakness. It was the very thing that allowed people to trust me with their wounds. And Chloe and I were also approached by a foundation offering to fund a second location in a neighboring city. And when the paperwork arrived, I stared at the numbers in disbelief, and she said we earned this, and I believed her because we had built something out of nothing, and now that something was becoming a blueprint for others. And during a late afternoon meeting with our legal advisor, I noticed a familiar face walk through the waiting room doors, and for a moment I could not breathe, because it was Derek, my ex, the one who had walked away when the weight of my student loans made the future feel too uncertain, and he looked older, tired maybe, but still carried that same charm in his shoulders, and he smiled cautiously and said, "I came to say congratulations," and I said thank you, wondering if he expected more, and he said I was wrong back then. I thought safety meant comfort, but now I see that real safety is building something solid even when it is uncomfortable. And I told him I forgave him, and I meant it not because I wanted to hold his hand again, but because I no longer needed his apology to feel whole. And he asked if we could have coffee sometime, and I said maybe, and walked away feeling nothing but peace. And on the drive home I thought about how many pieces of myself I had once given away, hoping someone would return them polished and perfect. And now I had retrieved every shard and put them back together, not to be flawless, but to be whole. And my parents continued volunteering, showing up every week with small gestures and kind words. And while the past still lingered like a shadow, I no longer let it stretch over every moment. And one Sunday afternoon my father brought a photo album from my childhood filled with pictures I had not seen in decades, and we sat together on clinic steps flipping through pages, and he pointed to a photo of me in a white dress at a science fair holding up a medal, and he said, "You always had it in you," and I said, "I know," and the simplicity of that exchange held more healing than any grand gesture ever could. And as the spring came, we hosted our first clinic anniversary event, inviting all the families we had served over the year, and we decorated the courtyard with string lights and hand-painted signs, and set up booths for free checkups and games for kids. And when the sun dipped below the horizon, I stood at the small podium and looked out at the crowd, and I saw faces I remembered from emergencies and long nights and follow-up calls, and I began to speak not from notes, but from the center of everything we had endured. And I said, "We are not here because we had perfect paths, we are here because we kept walking even when the road disappeared." And the applause felt like an embrace, and Chloe stood beside me beaming. And after the event, as we cleaned up the space, she turned to me and said, "I think you have always been the heart," and I said, "And you have always been the hands," and together we built something that beats and moves and saves. And later that night, as I sat on my balcony watching the stars, I thought about how once upon a time I used to measure my worth in debt, in disappointment, in being overlooked. And now I measured it in impact, in laughter, in the lives we touched. And while my sister and I had taken the same exam, worn the same coats, graduated on the same day, it was what we did after that made all the difference, because while she had her loans erased by our parents, I had carried every dollar, every unpaid hour, every tear, and turned it into something no one could take away. And I realized that justice does not always come in balance. Sometimes it comes in the ability to rise anyway, and in that moment I knew I no longer needed anyone to pay me back, because I had already invested in something far greater than money, and it had given me more than I ever imagined, and I would keep going, not for validation, For the next little girl who walked into our clinic believing she was too invisible to matter, and I would kneel down, look her in the eyes, and tell her that I see her, and that she matters, and that she can become anything, and that maybe, just maybe, she will believe it a little sooner than I did. The wind was soft that evening as I walked out of the clinic with the last box of files in my arms, the kind of soft that makes the air feel like silk brushing past your skin, and Chloe was locking the door behind me and humming a song she used to sing when we were kids, something about sunshine and open roads, and for a moment I paused in the parking lot, letting the sounds of the night soak into my chest, because this was the end of a chapter and the beginning of something we had only dreamed of. And the clinic was not closing, it was moving to a bigger space with new walls and more rooms and a wider reach. And yet, as I stood there with the key to our future in my coat pocket, I could not help but think about how far we had come from two young women in white coats standing on a graduation stage with matching smiles and completely different realities, and back then we had not known how uneven the ground was beneath our feet, and yet we had still walked forward, and now here we were again, only this time we were building the road ourselves. And as we drove to the new location, I watched the city lights pass by the windshield, and remembered how many nights I had driven alone in silence, replaying every rejection, every unpaid bill, every moment I had felt small or invisible. And now Chloe sat beside me holding a folder full of architectural plans, and her voice was steady and excited, and it reminded me that forgiveness does not always mean forgetting, it means choosing to build anyway. And when we arrived at the new space, the construction crew was still finishing the final touches, and the smell of fresh paint clung to the air, and I ran my fingers along the clean edge of a new doorway, imagining the stories that would unfold here, the children who would sit on the exam tables, mothers who would ask questions with trembling hands, the fathers who would stand quietly in the corners, trying not to show worry. And Chloe opened a window and let the breeze flow in, and said, "This feels right," and I agreed, because it did not just feel like progress, it felt like home. And the next morning we hosted a small blessing ceremony with local leaders and volunteers and patients who had become family, and as we stood in front of the ribbon with oversized scissors in our hands, I saw my mother in the crowd holding a bouquet and tears in her eyes, and my father beside her nodding with pride. And for the first time in years I did not feel like I had to protect myself from their presence, because somewhere along the way the sharp edges between us had worn down, and in their place was something softer, not perfect, but sincere. And as the ribbon fell, and the doors opened, and laughter spilled into the hallway, I felt something rise in my throat, and I swallowed it down, because there was still work to do, and the days that followed were a blur of checkups and new patients and stories being shared across desks. And as the sun rose and set again and again, we began to find our rhythm in this new space, like dancers were learning an old song in a bigger room. And Chloe became more than just my sister and business partner. She became the kind of woman I looked up to fiercely and unapologetically, because she had grown too, not just in skill, but in depth, and I saw her sit with patience longer, ask better questions, listen with an open heart, and the same grace she once reserved for herself she now offered to others, and it made me love her more. And I knew she had started attending therapy and journaling and working through the guilt she never spoke about, because even if she had been given more financially, she had lost things too. And one evening we sat on the clinic roof watching the sky turn from gold to charcoal, and she turned to me and said, "I never said thank you for not giving up on me." And I said, "I never said thank you for finally showing up." And we smiled at each other, not as rivals, not as victims, not as daughters stuck in an old family pattern, but as women who had clawed their way through pain and found purpose on the other side. And I remembered how the journey had felt impossible in the beginning, how I used to wake up with heaviness in my chest and cry in stairwells and wonder if all this effort would ever matter. And now people called us doctor, not just with respect, but with affection, and our names were spoken in homes we had never stepped into, and our advice was shared in community forums, and our clinic was featured in an article about healing spaces led by women, and a photo of Chloe and me stood side by side was printed beside the headline. And when I saw it, I did not cringe or downplay it. I let it settle into my bones, because we had earned every pixel. And then one week, and I returned to my childhood neighborhood for a charity event, and Walked past the old bookstore where I used to study for exams between shifts and saw a young girl sitting by the window with a stack of textbooks and a highlighter in her hand, and I wanted to walk in and tell her that her dreams would be hard and sometimes unfair, but if she kept going, she would not just make it, she would transform everything around her, and maybe she would see someone else in pain and say, "I understand," and that would be enough. And I thought about all the girls who would never be told that their softness was strength and their struggles were seeds, and I hoped I had become the kind of woman who lived loud enough for them to hear it anyway. And I turned to walk away and caught my reflection in the glass, and for the first time I saw not the tired eyes or the weight of the past, but the light that came from building something true and lasting. And when I got back to the clinic, Chloe was finishing a call, and she looked up and said, "We are booked for the next 3 months." And I laughed, not because it was overwhelming, but because it meant we were needed, and being needed is its own kind of joy. And we ordered dinner from our favorite food truck and sat on the floor of the break room with our shoes off and our backs against the wall. And as we ate, I thought about how we had always assumed that justice would come in the form of fairness, but maybe it comes in resilience, in choosing to pour into others what was once withheld from us. And I told Chloe that, and she nodded and said, "And maybe love is just showing up even after you have been hurt and staying long enough to matter." And I agreed, because we were not just daughters or doctors or survivors, we were builders. And for the first time in a long time, I felt proud not just of what we had created, but of who I had become. And when I finally went home that night, I looked at the framed diploma on my wall, and next to it, I placed a photo from the ribbon cutting, and I whispered thank you to the woman who kept going when it would have been easier to stop, and to the sister who finally saw me, and to the family that eventually returned, and to every stranger who once believed in me when I did not. And as I turned off the lights and crawled into bed, I thought to myself, this is not just the end of the story, it is the beginning of everything I never thought I could have. And somehow I did, and maybe that is the real reward, not the absence of struggle, but the presence of something beautiful on the other side of it. And I closed my eyes and slept without worry, because I had become the kind of woman who no longer needed approval to know she was enough. This story is not just about revenge, it is about truth, pain, and rising stronger than before. If this hit your heart, then you know what to do. Like the video, drop your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more real stories that burn like fire. Until next time, stay sharp, stay loud, stay rebel.